Welcome back to Face the State. I'm Ariana Bennett. Thank you for staying with us. Well, in the last segment, you heard the arguments for keeping the death penalty in Nevada. Now we'll switch to the other side of the issue, those working to have it abolished. Nancy Hart, president of the Nevada Coalition Against the Death Penalty, is here for that. Nancy, thank you so much for coming on the show.
My pleasure.
So your coalition is actively working to get this abolished. How long have you been working on that?
The coalition has existed since 2002, so we've been around for 16 years, a little more than 16 years, and have been educating about the issue, and we're a nonprofit organization that seeks primarily to educate members of the public and others, policymakers, around the flaws and bad public policy that we believe the death penalty is. So
if it were to happen, how would the process work to get it abolished?
Well, it's provided for in Nevada law, so in order to repeal that law, you would have to have a bill in the legislature to repeal Nevada's law. As a practical matter, that's the most direct way of getting rid of the death penalty. But in reality, there are other ways in which the death penalty shows a decline, and that's true around the country, but it's also true in Nevada that you can have juries who are less inclined to impose death sentences, and that's part of a national trend that we're finding. You can also have a decline in the number of executions that are carried out. And of course, if juries are imposing it less, then you have a decline in new death sentences. So that's not necessarily getting rid of the death penalty, but it does effectively it lowers the amount of cases that are subject to the death penalty.
And then there's also going through the court system. Is that something that you guys do?
We do not handle any litigation, no. We are, as I say, an educational organization and advocacy group. We don't get involved in litigation other than to follow it.
Yeah. Now, at one point, the Supreme Court did rule that the death penalty was unconstitutional, and then, it went back on that decision. Do you see the pendulum swinging back in the other direction?
Well, certainly that's one of the things that we would hope for, that was the United States Supreme Court, as you're mentioning. Back in 1972, they ruled that it was unconstitutional, and we hold that that decision is still correct. And although the Supreme Court a few years later said that it was okay, under certain circumstances, in certain procedural limitations, we believe that it still is unconstitutional, and we would urge the Supreme Court to find that. It can also be found by state Supreme Courts to be unconstitutional under state law, and again, you can have legislatures repealing it. So there are some avenues through the courts as well as through the legislature for getting rid of it.
So what's your group's primary argument for why this should go away?
I'm not sure that we have a primary argument. We're a group of people and organizations that have a range of opinions. All of us are opposed to the death penalty, obviously, that's our name. But some come from a moral standpoint or a philosophical standpoint of being opposed under any circumstances. And I think we also have members who approach this on the fact that there might be an issue that they have learned about. There's many ways in which the death penalty is implemented that are quite troubling. Everything from racial bias and economic bias in the application of the death penalty to arbitrary and disproportionate sentencing that happens even from among counties. For example, in Nevada, Clark County has an enormous number of filings, and no other county in the state has anywhere near the number of filings, even at all, or in relation to their population. And in fact, Clark County has I think the highest number of pending cases in any county in the country at this point, far higher than other counties that historically have had high death cases. Maricopa County in Arizona, Riverside County in California, Harris County in Texas. All of those counties show a dramatic reduction in how many cases they have pending, and we have over 60 cases filed in Clark County that are pending at the trial level right now, which is staggering, and it puts a huge burden on the state and the county from a cost standpoint. So that's another reason that some people oppose the death penalty, is because it's extremely financially costly to maintain.
So then is the position of the coalition that the highest penalty for murder should be life without parole?
I mean, we don't take a position on what it should be, but that certainly is on the books in Nevada, and that is a very severe penalty because you lose, you're going to live the rest of your days in prison, which ironically is pretty much what happens if you have the death penalty these days, because you aren't executed, because the only people that are executed are those who want to die, like Mr. Dozier, who has given up his appeals. And of course, even in that case, we have an inability to do it because the drugs don't exist. So
it's the inefficiency is a big part of the issue.
Inefficiency is, for some, a very compelling issue. We spend an enormous amount of money. Again, Clark County is spending millions of dollars to prosecute those 60 cases that are pending, and ultimately for a very futile system, because we're not actually executing individuals. So it's a very costly process for no outcome.
Now, we've heard, from families of victims before, when the death penalty comes up, that for them the death penalty is closure. Something horrific has been done to their family, and they don't want this person existing, in their space anymore. How do you reconcile that if the death penalty comes off the table?
Actually, I think what's interesting is to realize that not all victims' family members have the same voice, and there are actually an increasing number of family members of homicide victims who speak out against the death penalty because they believe it will not promote healing for them or their family members. And so I think that it's impossible to say that all victims have the same experience. So while there might be some victim family members who would say that it would bring closure for them, one, we don't really follow how victim family members feel 10 years afterwards and whether or not they actually get closure. But I also think you need to look at the larger victim family member population, because of course the death penalty is supposed to be reserved for the worst of the worst, but we have lots of other homicides in the state who have family member victims or victims who have family members, and they have suffered traumatic loss through violent crime. There's no nice murder, and I think that we need to design a system that addresses the needs of all victims of violent crime, all family members of victims of homicide.
Now, part of the concern that we hear from the prosecuting side of this is that having the death penalty on the table provides a tool in the toolbox that they can pursue, the highest punishment, and then everything beyond that is lesser, and so then everything shifts downward, almost like if they can't pursue the death penalty anymore, the highest they can pursue is life without parole. Then fewer people will get the highest, and then everything just kind of shifts down, and so we're more lenient with sentences, basically. Do you see any issue with something like that, knowing that what they're saying is then in some cases someone who commits a murder could end up getting parole, and or more of them could end up getting parole?
Not at all. I think that is actually there's no evidence to suggest that there would be any fewer serious homicide prosecutions that would result in life without parole sentences. We have an enormous number of them already in this state, and I don't see why there would be any real drop in those. What you might see is that the people who would be otherwise eligible for death would be sentenced to life without parole, which, as I say, is a very serious penalty that cannot be, you're not out on parole. And I don't think it translates down to some homicide perpetrators getting off when they wouldn't have otherwise qualified for a lesser sentence for some other reason.
Okay. Now, there have been, a lot of different arguments for and against this. What about, public opinion here in Nevada previously has been fairly pro-death penalty. Do you sense that changing at all, and do you think that it matters?
I do sense it changing, and I think that, it depends on, if you look at national polling, I don't think we've done any real thorough polling within Nevada. We've had some what I would call superficial polls where someone is asked a simple question, do you support the death penalty, yes or no? And those polls around the country tend to come out, in favor of the death penalty. But when you ask in a more comprehensive way, do you support the death penalty if you know that there's also a sentence of life without parole? The numbers drop dramatically. And if you offer in a poll, do you support the death penalty if you know that there's life without parole and some way of providing restitution to victims, the support drops below 50%. So I have every reason to believe that in Nevada, that same kind of more comprehensive polling would result in that kind of those kinds of results. I don't think Nevadans are any different than Ohioans or Kansans or people from wherever around the country, and I think that the national polling does reveal that there is a declining trend, and I have every reason to believe that that Nevada's part of that.
Okay, well, we have just under a minute left. Is there anything else that you would want the public to know about this?
Well, I think one thing that it's important is that that the public should be concerned about this issue and should be following this issue and has a right to know what's going on. Our state is killing people, and if we're in the business of killing people, I think that we need to maintain transparency around how it's being done, and that's a really important part of maintaining a death penalty, is that it be something that the public can follow because it's being done in their names.
Okay, Nancy, thank you so much for your time. I sure appreciate it.
Thank you.
Well, that is it for this episode of Face the State. But for more information on this or to see past episodes, you can just head to our website. That's ktvn.com. Thank you so much for being with us. We'll see you next week.